Who was almost real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast, episode 122. Hello and welcome to this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. My name is Ken Zimmerman Jr., and this is the podcast dedicated to the history of professional wrestling from the 1860s to 1930. And in this episode, I will be discussing the early career of Reggie Siki, the first nationally known African American wrestler. And I will also do a short review on the documentary Memphis Heat. To start this week's episode, I wanted to start with an update. I'm about a third of the way through the book on the pioneer 19th century wrestlers. And I had said in a previous episode that one of the wrestlers I did not believe ever worked a match was Henry Moses Duffer. And I have to update everybody and say Henry Moses Duffer definitely worked matches during his career. Not as frequently in the big national matches that he had with John McMahon and Duncan Ross, although quite a few matches with Ross later on. But Duffer definitely worked matches when he went back home to Vermont in the summer. He would be going to 6-hour draws with Duncan Ross in Boston, but then he would go and do a 5-match tournament at the annual 4th of July celebration in Bradford, Vermont, and he would come in second to his friend George Flagg in those tournaments. So he's definitely working matches, not only in Vermont, but occasionally he would work some series with Duncan Ross and others. So definitely Henry Moses Duffer did work matches. As a rule, almost every wrestler I have researched has worked matches. They may have worked a few of their matches, but they worked everyone other than George Hackenschmidt and Tom Jenkins I found so far. All of them worked a match here or there, or worked a lot of their matches. I recently read a book, and the name of the book is Vern, Inside and Outside the Ring, and it's by Brian Ferguson. This was Brian Ferguson's first book that he ever wrote. He's a retired military and grew up in the AWA area, a fan of Vern Gagne. And I did enjoy the book, so I definitely wanted to plug it. He covers a lot of Vern's life outside of the ring, and he does cover his professional wrestling career fairly well. There's a lot more about his early wrestling career in Chicago in the 50s. Once he gets into promotion and he's in the AWA, it's kind of more of a 30,000 foot view, but you get a lot of the things going on outside the ring with Vern, as well as some of his exploits inside the ring. But what I found most fascinating in this book was he goes into great detail with Vern's amateur wrestling career, particularly his time in college from 1947 to 1949. He went to college for 1 year, won a Big Nine wrestling title, but because of World War II, his college career is interrupted, and he goes into the Marine Corps for the duration of the war. And then when he comes out, he goes back to school at the University of Minnesota. And so during the 1947-1948 wrestling season, Vern would wrestle Ray Gunkel, who wrestled for Ohio State, Mike DiBiase, who wrestled for the University of Nebraska, Joe Blanchard, who would wrestle for the Kansas State University, and then Bob Geigel, who wrestled for Iowa. And in that season, Gunkel manhandled Gagne, but Gagne managed to beat everyone else. And if you're a fan of professional wrestling, a lot of those names will be familiar to you. Ray Gunkel was a star in the 50s. He would go on to be the promoter in Atlanta. Mike DiBiase, which is huge star, a junior heavyweight world champion several times. Joe Blanchard would have a good career, but he would really make his name as the promoter in San Antonio. And then Bob Geigel, of course, would go on to be a booker and later on in the late 50s, the owner of the Kansas City territory, or Central States as we know it. And in the semifinals in 1947, Vern Gagne lost to Dick Hutton, future NWA World Heavyweight Champion, the man who Luthez chose to succeed him as champion. And Hutton won the 1947 NCAA Heavyweight Tournament. Gagne would go into 1948, and they had a 191-pound class. That was the only year I can tell in the 40s that they had the 191-pound class. They didn't have it in 47. They had it for 48, and Vern would be an alternate in the 1948 Olympics at 191 pounds. And then at the end of 1948, they would go back to that was a heavyweight class. So Vern won in 1948 his third Big Nine title. He won the 1948 NCAA tournament in the 191-pound class, and he was the alternate in the 1948 Olympics. Now we jump into 1949. The 191-pound class has been eliminated. So he's back to wrestling in the heavyweight division. And poor Bob Geigel. Bob Geigel had a horrible time with Vern Gagne in the amateurs. Bob Geigel a lot of times was the favored wrestler, but he always struggled against Greg Gagne. Greg Gagne. He always struggled against Vern Gagne. Greg wasn't even born yet. So Vern would go on and win the 1949 NCAA wrestling tournament. And it was a shock as Dick Hutton had won the last three NCAA wrestling tournaments at heavyweight. So this was a big upset, and it was a referee's decision. The referee gave Vern Gagne the title on a disputed decision, but it was a super close match. Either one of them could have won. But that defeat, because it was the only time Dick Hutton did not win the NCAA tournament in his college career, that bothered Dick Hutton for the rest of his life. I think it was Mike Chapman talking about Dick Hutton for the NWA Wrestling Champion Series on the Shut Up and Wrestle podcast with Brian R. Solomon. So if you go onto that website and just look through the NWA Champion Series, when you come to the episode about Dick Hutton, that's where they talk about that. But Vern and Dick Hutton had got invited to a wrestling awards dinner, and this was either late 70s or sometime in the 80s, 30 to 40 years after Vern won this controversial decision. And Dick Hutton was being recognized. I think Vern was being recognized too. But when Dick Hutton was being recognized, he was really touched, and he gave a very gracious speech. But he couldn't help but look out to Vern and say, and Vern, you know you did not beat me in 1949. Now, Vern, to his credit, just kind of shook it off and laughed about it. But it bothered Dick Hutton for the rest of his life. He really thought that he had won that match. They both go on to professional careers. Vern Gagne has a much, much bigger professional career, even though Dick Hutton was, and his career lasted longer than people. I thought that he retired not long after he lost the NWA title, but he actually wrestled in California and other places for like 10 years, 12 years after that, and didn't retire until he got near his 40s, like many of the wrestlers did back then. The one thing I think that Mr. Ferguson had access to the family, because there's a lot of inside information in there about the family. They do talk about the nursing home incident involving Vern. And while Mr. Ferguson is not the one that's making this assertion, the family does try to defend what Vern did that ended with one of the other patients there losing their life. and I understand Mr. Ferguson is just printing their version of it. The version's pretty hard to swallow, and probably everybody just ought to just realize this was a horrible, horrible thing that happened with two elderly gentlemen, neither one of whom was really mentally cognizant anymore. And we'll probably never know exactly what happened, but you had a barely still in shape, even though he was in his late 70s, early 80s, Vern, and a 90-something-year-old get into some kind of altercation, and the 90-year-old, broke a hip and passed away not too long after that. So that was tragic, and I understand why he put that, the family's version of what happened in the book. But I don't think anybody looks differently at Vern Gagne because that happened, because everybody understands that he was suffering from dementia, as was the other patient. Overall, I do recommend the book, and I'll have links at the show notes at kenzermanjr.com/episode 122. But let's jump into the main content. Reginald Siki, the original Reginald Siki. So a lot of people know Sweet Daddy Siki, who originally wrestled as Reggie Siki, late 40s, early 50s, whose name was James Elkins. But the original Reggie Siki, who Sweet Daddy Siki took his name from, was Reginald Siki, who was born Rensselaer Stanley Livingston Siki Berry in Kansas City, Missouri on December 28, 1899, 3 days before the turn of a new century. And Reginald Siki was a skilled African-American wrestler who made his debut at 23 years of age in 1923. And Siki wrestled two notable matches in Chicago, Illinois in December 1923. So he's in his first year, he's a rookie, and he wrestles two matches. The first match is against Stanislaus Zbyszko, who at the time was the former World Heavyweight Wrestling Champion. He had lost the title back to Ed Strangler Lewis in March of 1922. So Siki wrestles Stanislaus Zbyszko in front of 4,000 fans at the Chicago Coliseum on Friday, December 7th, 1923. And they are billing Siki from Senegal, even though he was born in Kansas City, Missouri. And this is very common. As we were talking about in last week's episode, Jack Claiborne, for a lot of his career, was billed as South African. I think he was billed from another country. So it was not unusual for them to try to draw up fan interest by claiming somebody was from a foreign country, even when they might not be. And Jack Curley showed an interest in Siki early on and booked him through Ed White in Chicago. And that's probably why Reggie Siki, in his first year in the business, and with the disadvantage, and make no mistake, it was a disadvantage for him coming into the business in the 1920s as an African-American wrestler. With the racial attitudes of the time, he was going to have to work 10 times harder to get ahead than his white counterparts. But Curley was impressed by him, and so he books him through Ed White in Chicago. And Siki actually wrestles Zbyszko in the main event. So one of the things Siki had going for him was his physique. He stood 6'2" tall, and he was a full 5 inches taller than Zbyszko. Although Zbyszko outweighed the 195-pound Siki by 20 pounds. As he would get older, he would fill out a little bit more, and he too would get up around that 220, 225 range. But at this time, he was right, around the 200-pound mark. And at first, fans thought it would be an easy match for Zbyszko because they don't really know that much about Reggie Siki. But right off the bat at the start of the match, Siki surprises Zbyszko with a double leg takedown. And Zbyszko jumps to his feet, angry, demonstrating, and acting like Siki had done something illegal when nothing that Siki had done was illegal. But again, it's helping to build this mystique around this new wrestler. And so Zbyszko, after he remonstrates with the referee, He goes and tries to apply a half Nelson, followed by a hammerlock, but Siki escaped both of them. And Siki started keeping a pace that started to make it look like Zbyszko was wearing out. And when Siki applied a toe hold, it looked like Zbyszko would give up. Remember, Zbyszko used to wrestle barefoot. And so the fans should believe that he has a better chance than somebody in boots and slipping a toe hold. But Ed Lewis had made Zbyszko give up to a toe hold in a prior match. In this, what we would expect to happen happened here. The experienced Zbyszko slipped the hold before Siki could make Zbyszko tap. After an hour and 7 minutes of wrestling, Zbyszko finally was able to pin Siki with a jackknife and scissors hold. And the crowd is shocked because it's taken Zbyszko an hour and 7 minutes. Well, Zbyszko's probably made him look really good. So as they start to wrestle the second fall, and the fans are clearly behind Siki, they're cheering and supporting Siki. Zbyszko tries to pin Siki right away to start the second fall, but Siki maintains a perfect bridge. Zbyszko starts jumping up and down, not jumping up and down, but he's lifting his body up and dropping it on Siki's stomach to try to break the bridge. Yet he cannot break the bridge. So we already seen, despite the 20-pound weight advantage, Zbyszko cannot break Siki's bridge. Siki is obviously a very strong wrestler and not someone to be taken lightly. Siki, after escaping the near pin, threw Zbyszko half out of the ring, and this brought the fans to their feet and cheering wildly. Finally, Zbyszko is able to win the second fall with a jackknife and headlock combination. And despite losing the match in 2 straight falls, the fans are cheering wildly for Reggie Siki. This also must have impressed Ed White, the Chicago promoter, because 2 weeks later, on Friday, December 21st, 1923, 7 days before Siki would turn 24, Siki returns to the Chicago... That was easy for me to say. Siki returns to the Chicago Coliseum to wrestle in the opener against Andre Anderson. And we talked about Andre Anderson in a previous episode. He was the boxer, sometimes wrestler, that was shot for not taking a dive against Wayne Big Munn in 1926. But Siki's not in the main event. He's in the opener, but being in the opener, Siki defeats Anderson with a reverse body hold in only 11 minutes 35 seconds of the one-fall match. And the fans cheered Siki louder than any other wrestler on the card that night. So he's already getting over as a huge star in Chicago. Siki remained the biggest African-American star of the 1920s, and he preceded both Jack Claiborne and Jim Mitchell as a major draw in professional wrestling. Unfortunately, Siki died at only 48 years of age on December 24th, 1948, just a few days before his 49th birthday. So Siki was living in California and had changed his name to Kamal Abdur Rahman and was picking up his wife from the home of singer Tony Martin, where his wife, Reggie Siki's wife, worked as a housekeeper. And Abdur Rahman, Reggie Siki, who had changed his name, injured himself seriously in a match with Vic Holbrook earlier in 1948 and could not wrestle. I don't know exactly how he hurt himself. I have read the account of the match in the newspaper. It was a 2 out of 3 fall match. He finished the match, but they had to help him to the back. And they never really said what the injury was, but he just sort of disappears off the LA cards after that match. And so he was still trying to recover from that. And because he could not work, he wasn't getting paid. So they were dependent on his wife's salary from working for Tony Martin. So Abdurrahman is going to pick up his wife at Martin's home, And he walks up to the front door and knocks on the door. And when his wife opens the door, Kamal Abdurrahman, born Reggie Siki, drops right dead at her feet. And he had suffered a massive heart attack and died right there on the doorstep. And his wife, when talking to the newspapers, said she was disappointed that the professional wrestling business did not take care of wrestlers injured while working in the ring. Abdurrahman could not work while he recovered from the injury. Today, I think wrestling fans know a lot more about the Black Panther Jim Mitchell and Bobo Brazil than they know about Reggie Siki or Jack Claiborne. But without Siki and Claiborne, there might not have been a Jim Mitchell or a Bobo Brazil. Each of these pioneering wrestlers, and Jim Mitchell and Bobo Brazil did a lot to open up opportunities for African American wrestlers as well. So this is all a chain, a path forward, where each generation is reaching back and pulling the other generation up. And we shouldn't forget the contributions of someone like Reggie Siki, Kamal Abdurrahman, and the contributions he made for the professional wrestling business and for his community. The last thing I wanted to cover this week, and I won't go into a terrible amount of detail because if you want to watch the documentary, I don't want to ruin it for you. But I recently watched Memphis Heat, which is a 2011 documentary about wrestling in the city of Memphis, Tennessee. And I thought that I had not seen it before, but after I watched it, a lot of it seemed pretty familiar. So I've either seen parts of these interviews before and different things, or I've seen this movie and I just forgot. But there were a couple of things that struck me about it. It covers Memphis wrestling history from about the late 50s until Jerry Jarrett goes out of business in the 1980s. And a lot of it is about crowd heat and getting heat with the fans. But you found that there was quite a bit of heat between Jackie Fargo and Sputnik Monroe. Sputnik Monroe was probably the biggest star with Billy Wicks of the 1950s, and Jackie Fargo was probably the biggest star of the 1960s, early 1970s, and the two of them really, I guess, didn't see eye to eye. One thing that I did want to make note of, because there is a tale of integration woven into this, because Sputnik Monroe was extremely popular with the African American community in Memphis. And when they were getting ready for their big series of matches with Billy Wicks, Sputnik Monroe always looked up in the crow's nest where the African American fans were forced to sit at the time. But there were a lot of seats in the rest of the auditorium. And he knew that they were turning away African American fans each week, yet they had plenty of seats for the white community. So he went on TV and said, if my people are not allowed to sit wherever they want in the Ellis Auditorium instead of being stuck in a crow's nest, I'm not going to wrestle here anymore. Which was quite an audacious statement for the 1950s, particularly in a southern town like Memphis. But the most shocking thing was he had enough pull, enough power, as I'm sure did Roy Welch and Nick Goulas, to get them to desegregate the Ellis Auditorium. And the biggest news of all was when they did it, there was no problems. They were always worried that there would be riots and things of that nature, and there wasn't. People accepted it because they were all more intent on going to see the wrestling than fighting with each other. And I know, let me stress this, I know as a historian of professional wrestling, money drives everything. Green is the number one color that all the promoters and everything were concerned about. So there was not a lot of noblesse oblige that was the reason that they wanted to desegregate the auditorium. They wanted to desegregate the auditorium because they believed it would bring them more money because allowing the African Americans to sit wherever they wanted would allow them to fill that building up instead of it being under capacity because the African American fans were stuck in one spot and the white fans could sit wherever they wanted but not fill up the auditorium. The goal was to fill up the auditorium. But when you hear Sputnik Monroe talk about that time, it does seem that his time around the African American community did give him an appreciation for just the tough things that they had to deal with every day. And that there was a certain amount of concern as well and happiness on his part that the African American fans were not stuck in the crow's nest anymore. So, yes, I think his motivation, and no Gulas and Welch motivation, was financial. That financial motivation helped lead to some social change that was good in that town. Jackie Fargo, who is such a huge star down there, to me really comes across as unlikable in this video. And it could just be that, he was getting older. He's just a little cranky. I do think it's great that they had exquisite timing when they put this movie together, because they did it in 2011. If they'd have waited 7 years, almost all of the pioneer, you can't call them pioneer wrestlers, but the wrestlers from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s that knew how Memphis really became such a big territory, they would have all been gone had they waited just a little bit longer to put that movie together. So it was great that they did that. And then my last thought about this documentary, and there'll be a link in the show notes at kenzermanjr.com/episode 122 if you're interested in this documentary. Jerry Jarrett said it the best when they were talking about Vince McMahon and what he did to wrestling in the 1980s. And Jarrett said it would be impossible to do today what we did back then. Because of cable television, because of the internet, and because of instant communication, the territories would have died anyway. And I think he's right. There would have been, whether there would have been 5 companies instead of Vince's just going for one company, the wrestling landscape would have changed considerably. And if you look back at the time, right before Vince started his national push, there were a lot of territories that had aged out, were on their last legs. I've always blamed Bob Geigel for what happened in St. Louis, but his territory was on its last legs around that time too. Los Angeles was pretty much dead. Detroit was dead. It had been dead since the late 70s. Indianapolis was really on its last legs. That's why Vince, one of the places he did great during the national expansion at first was Detroit, because they hadn't had wrestling in a number of years. So one of the few Midwestern towns that Vince did well in was Detroit. But something would have been different with the territories. So that's it for this week's episode. Next week, I am going to answer a question that has always interested me, and I hope it will be of interest to you. We're going to look at a spot show town and where that spot show town, which territories it fit in during its history. And I will give you a further update with some of the 19th century wrestlers as well. And I think we're going to review a show from Florida in 1982, but that's still up in the air. So until next week, everybody, take care. Bye-bye.